23,000 feet above the forests of southern Germany, Captain Robert Mitchell felt his P-51 Mustang shudder as another burst of cannon fire streaked past his canopy. The morning sun of March 15, 1945, painted the contrails above him in shades of orange and gold, a beauty that stood in sharp contrast to the deadly dance unfolding in the crystalline air. Mitchell's hands, steady despite the pounding of his heart, rested lightly on the control stick as he tracked the Messerschmitt jet fighter that had been pursuing him for the past 3 minutes. The German pilot behind him surely believed he had the American cornered, that this would be another easy victory to add to his tally, another red-tailed fighter sent spiraling toward the earth below. What that German pilot could not know was that he was about to become a footnote in aviation history, part of a story so remarkable that even Mitchell's own commanders would struggle to believe it. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how one man's unconventional thinking, born from necessity and refined through countless hours of practice, would transform him from a skilled pilot into a legend, and how a technique dismissed as reckless would prove to be the key to defeating an enemy that possessed superior technology, but had underestimated the ingenuity of those they faced. Robert James Mitchell had not set out to revolutionize aerial combat tactics. Born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1921, he had grown up in a world that told him at every turn what he could not do, where he could not go, what he could not become. His father, Thomas Mitchell, worked as a railroad porter, spending weeks away from home riding the rails between Alabama and Chicago, bringing back stories of a wider world that seemed impossibly distant to young Robert. His mother, Clara, cleaned houses for white families in the affluent neighborhoods on the other side of town, returning home each evening with tales of grand pianos and libraries filled with leather-bound books, luxuries that existed in a universe parallel to, but separate from their own. The boy who would one day develop the most effective jet-fighting technique of the war spent his childhood watching birds, not with any scientific purpose initially, but simply because they fascinated him. He would lie on his back in the small yard behind their shotgun house, watching sparrows and mockingbirds wheel and dive, noting how they could stop mid-flight, how they could reverse direction with a flutter of wings, how the laws of physics seemed to bend around their small bodies. His mother would call him a dreamer, though not unkindly, and his father would shake his head and remind him that colored boys did not become pilots, did not soar through the sky like the birds he spent so much time observing. But dreamers have a way of finding paths that practical minds overlook. When the war came to America in December of 1941, bringing with it a desperate need for pilots, the impossible began to seem merely improbable. The Army Air Corps, facing pressure from civil rights groups and a genuine shortage of aviators, had reluctantly opened its training programs to African-American men. The program was segregated, confined to a single facility in Tuskegee, Alabama, and many in the military establishment expected it to fail, hoped it would fail, wanted to prove once and for all that colored men lacked the intelligence, the courage, the inherent superiority required to master the complexities of aerial combat. Mitchell enlisted in January of 1942, 3 weeks after his 21st birthday. His mother wept when he left, though whether from pride or fear, or some combination of the two, he never quite knew. His father shook his hand with a grip that conveyed more than words ever could, a pressure that said, "Be careful, make us proud, come home, prove them wrong all at once." The train that carried him from Birmingham to Tuskegee passed through countryside he had known all his life, but on that January morning, everything looked different, charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. The training at Tuskegee was designed to be impossible. The washout rate hovered around 75%, far higher than at white training facilities, a deliberate attempt to prove the inferiority that prejudice insisted must exist. The instructors were a mix of civilians and military officers, some genuinely committed to the program's success, others openly hoping for its failure. Captain Howard Patterson, a white officer from Georgia who served as one of the primary flight instructors, made no secret of his doubts. He would stand in front of the classroom of eager young men, his arms crossed over his chest, and tell them flatly that most of them would wash out, that flying was not a matter of wanting but of natural ability, and that natural ability was not distributed equally across all races. What Patterson and others like him did not understand was that these young men had been proving themselves against stacked odds their entire lives. Every one of them had navigated a world designed to limit their ambitions, had found ways to excel in schools, with hand-me-down textbooks and overworked teachers, had maintained dignity in the face of daily humiliations. The training at Tuskegee was brutal, demanding, exhausting, but it was not, despite the hopes of some, impossible. Mitchell proved to be a natural pilot, though not in the way his instructors expected. His test scores were good but not exceptional. His physical conditioning was adequate but not outstanding. What set him apart was his capacity for spatial reasoning, his ability to visualize three-dimensional movement in ways that seemed almost instinctive. When other cadets struggled to understand the relationship between stick pressure and aircraft response, Mitchell grasped it immediately. When instructors described complex maneuvers, he could see them in his mind's eye, could imagine the forces at work, the flow of air over wings, the delicate balance between gravity and thrust. But it was in the area of emergency procedures that Mitchell truly distinguished himself. The curriculum included extensive training on what to do when things went wrong, how to recover from spins, how to handle engine failures, how to coax a damaged aircraft back to friendly territory. Most cadets approached these lessons with understandable nervousness, viewing them as necessary evils to be endured. Mitchell approached them with fascination. He wanted to know not just what to do, but why it worked, wanted to understand the underlying principles that governed aircraft behavior in crisis situations. It was during a training flight in May of 1943 that Mitchell first experimented with the technique that would later make him famous. He had been practicing aerial combat maneuvers with Lieutenant James Parker, another cadet who would become his closest friend in the squadron. Parker, flying a worn PT-17 Stearman, had positioned himself on Mitchell's tail, simulating an attack. According to doctrine, Mitchell should have attempted to outturn his pursuer or to dive away, using speed to create separation. Instead, Mitchell did something that made Parker's blood run cold. Mitchell chopped his throttle completely, deployed his flaps, and essentially brought his aircraft to the edge of a stall. The sudden deceleration was so dramatic that Parker shot past him like a bullet, overshooting his target by hundreds of feet. In that brief moment, the pursued had become the pursuer, and Mitchell was perfectly positioned for a killing shot. When they landed, Parker climbed out of his cockpit shaking, not from fear but from excitement. Mitchell climbed out expecting a reprimand, possibly even a washout for executing such a dangerous maneuver. What he got instead was the beginning of a partnership that would refine the technique into something truly revolutionary. Their instructor that day, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Williams, one of the few African-American officers in the program, approached the two young men with an expression that revealed nothing. Mitchell stood at attention, preparing himself for the consequences of his unorthodox actions. Williams looked at him for a long moment, then asked a single question. "Why did you do that?" Not accusatory, not angry, simply curious. Mitchell explained his reasoning, how he had been thinking about the problem of a faster, more maneuverable opponent, how traditional evasive tactics assumed that both aircraft would maintain forward momentum, how he had wondered what would happen if that assumption was challenged. Williams listened without interrupting, and when Mitchell finished, the colonel nodded slowly. He told them that what Mitchell had done was incredibly dangerous, that bringing an aircraft to the edge of a stall in combat left no margin for error, that recovery required perfect timing and perfect execution. But he also told them that warfare was evolution, that tactics that worked yesterday might fail tomorrow, and that innovation often came from those willing to question established doctrine. He ordered them to continue developing the technique, but to do so carefully, systematically, with full awareness of the risks involved. Over the following months, Mitchell and Parker spent every available moment refining what they came to call the braking maneuver. They studied the physics involved, calculated the optimal altitude for recovery, determined the exact throttle and flap settings that would produce maximum deceleration without inducing an unrecoverable stall. They practiced until their muscles remembered the sequence without conscious thought, until they could execute the maneuver in their sleep. They documented everything meticulously, creating a manual that outlined the technique in detail, complete with diagrams and performance data. Technical Sergeant Michael Torres, a Mexican-American mechanic who maintained their training aircraft, became an essential part of their team. Torres understood aircraft systems with an intimacy that bordered on the spiritual. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, could feel imbalances in propeller rotation through the soles of his feet. When Mitchell and Parker explained what they were trying to accomplish, Torres immediately grasped the mechanical challenges involved. The sudden throttle reduction created extreme stress on the engine. The rapid deployment of flaps could damage the actuating mechanisms. The aircraft's center of gravity shifted dramatically during the maneuver, creating control challenges that could prove fatal. Torres worked with them to modify their aircraft, making subtle adjustments that improved reliability without compromising airworthiness. He strengthened flap mounting points, adjusted carburetor settings to prevent engine flooding during rapid throttle changes, modified control linkages to provide better feedback during low-speed flight. These changes were minor individually, but collectively, they transformed the braking maneuver from a desperate gamble into a reliable tactical option. By the time Mitchell graduated from training in November of 1943, he had executed the braking maneuver over 200 times. He had practiced it at different altitudes, different speeds, different aircraft configurations. He had refined it to the point where he could predict, within a few feet, exactly where his aircraft would be at the end of the sequence. He had shared the technique with other members of his graduating class, creating a small cadre of pilots who understood its potential. What he did not have was any opportunity to use it in actual combat. The Tuskegee Airmen, as they had come to be known, faced a different kind of battle before they ever encountered enemy aircraft. Despite completing the same training as white pilots, despite demonstrating equal or superior skills, they were initially relegated to coastal patrol duties, protecting the American mainland from submarine attacks that never materialized. For months they flew endless hours over empty ocean, their talents wasted, their potential unrealized, their presence in the military grudgingly tolerated, but not genuinely welcomed. Mitchell arrived in Italy in February of 1944, assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group, one of the units that would eventually comprise the famous Red Tails. The squadron was equipped with P-40 Warhawks, sturdy aircraft, but outclassed by the latest German fighters. Their primary mission was bomber escort, protecting the heavy bombers that were systematically destroying Germany's industrial capacity. It was dangerous work, demanding work, but it was also work that the military establishment believed colored pilots could handle without endangering white aircrews. The reality of combat proved different from any training scenario. The German pilots they faced were experienced, skilled, and flying aircraft that in many cases surpassed American fighters in performance. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 could outclimb most American aircraft. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 possessed devastating firepower and exceptional maneuverability. And beginning in the summer of 1944, a new threat appeared in the skies over Europe, one that rendered all previous tactical assumptions obsolete. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, an aircraft so advanced that it seemed to belong to a different era of warfare. Powered by twin turbojets instead of conventional piston engines, it could reach speeds in excess of 540 miles per hour, nearly 200 miles per hour, faster than the best Allied propeller-driven fighters. Its 430mm cannons could shred a bomber with a single burst. Most terrifyingly, it could appear from nowhere, make a high-speed pass, and disappear before defending fighters could react. Mitchell first encountered a 262 on August 7, 1944. His squadron was escorting a formation of B-17 flying fortresses, targeting oil refineries near Ploiești when the jets appeared. They came from above and behind, diving through the bomber formation with shocking speed, their cannons tearing into the heavy aircraft with devastating effect. Mitchell tried to intercept, pushing his Warhawk to its maximum speed, but he might as well have been trying to catch lightning. The jet flashed past him, its pilot probably not even aware of his presence, and was gone before he could bring his guns to bear. 3 bombers fell from the sky that day, spiraling down with smoke trailing from shattered engines and ruptured fuel tanks. Mitchell and his squadron mates circled helplessly, watching the parachutes bloom against the summer sky, counting silently to make sure everyone got out, knowing that there was nothing they could have done differently. The jets were simply too fast, too advanced, too far beyond anything they had the capability to counter. The debrief that evening was somber, the pilot struggling to describe an enemy that seemed almost supernatural in its capabilities. But Mitchell's mind was already working on the problem. Speed, he realized, was both the jet's greatest advantage and its potential weakness. The 262 could attack and escape with impunity, but that same speed limited its maneuverability. A jet traveling at 500 miles per hour could not turn as tightly as a propeller-driven fighter, traveling at 300 miles per hour. Physics was impartial, and the laws of inertia applied to all aircraft equally. The question was how to exploit that limitation, how to force a jet into a position where its speed became a liability rather than an asset. The answer, Mitchell believed, lay in the braking maneuver. If he could lure a jet into a stern chase, if he could make the enemy pilot believe he had an easy target, then execute the maneuver at precisely the right moment, the jet would overshoot by a massive margin. The closure rate would be so high that the enemy pilot would have no time to react, and in that brief window when the jet flashed past, when it transitioned from hunter to hunted, Mitchell would have his shot. There was just one problem. Mitchell's commanding officer, Colonel Harrison Blake, thought the idea was suicidal. Blake was a competent officer, a veteran of combat in North Africa, but he was also a man shaped by conventional thinking and racial prejudice. He had not requested assignment to command a colored fighter group, had made his objections clear when the orders came through, and had spent his time in Italy doing the minimum required, while counting the days until he could return to a white unit where, in his view, real military work was conducted. When Mitchell approached Blake with his proposal, the colonel's reaction was predictably negative. He told Mitchell that the braking maneuver was a stunt, that it had no place in actual combat, that attempting it against a jet would result in certain death. He reminded Mitchell that his job was to escort bombers, not to engage in individual heroics that would likely get him removed from service. He suggested with barely concealed condescension that Mitchell should focus on following established procedures rather than trying to invent new ones. Mitchell left the meeting frustrated but not defeated. He had faced skepticism and dismissal his entire life, had learned that changing minds required demonstration rather than argument. If Colonel Blake would not authorize the use of the braking maneuver, then Mitchell would have to create a situation where its effectiveness could not be denied. He would have to wait for the right opportunity, execute the technique perfectly, and produce results so undeniable that even Blake would have to acknowledge their validity. That opportunity came sooner than he expected. On September 3, 1944, Mitchell's squadron was escorting bombers targeting industrial facilities in Stuttgart when they were intercepted by a mixed force of conventional German fighters and two of the new jets. The jets made their usual high-speed pass, damaging one bomber before climbing away to prepare for another attack. Most of the escort fighters stayed close to the bombers, maintaining their protective formation as doctrine required. But Mitchell, spotting one of the jets beginning its next approach, broke formation and climbed to intercept. The German pilot, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, saw the lone American fighter climbing toward him and almost laughed. Weber had 17 confirmed victories, including 3 American fighters that had made the mistake of trying to engage his jet in combat. This would be 18, an easy kill to add to his record before returning to base. He adjusted his approach slightly, lining up the red-tailed Mustang in his gun sight, waiting until the range closed to 600 meters before opening fire. Mitchell saw the muzzle flashes from the jet's cannons and immediately executed the braking maneuver. He chopped the throttle, deployed full flaps, and pulled back on the stick, bringing his Mustang to the edge of a stall. His airspeed dropped from 310 miles per hour to 170 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. The effect on Weber was catastrophic. The jet, traveling at over 500 miles per hour, overshot by nearly half a mile. Weber, startled by the American's disappearance from his gun sight, pulled up hard, assuming his target had been hit and was falling. But Mitchell had not fallen. He had recovered from the maneuver exactly as planned, had brought his aircraft back under full control, and now found himself in the perfect position. The jet was directly ahead of him, climbing slowly, its speed reduced by the steep ascent. For a brief moment, perhaps 5 seconds, the hunted had become the hunter. Mitchell opened fire, his .650 caliber machine guns converging on the jet's engines. He saw his rounds strike home, saw smoke begin to pour from the left turbine, saw the aircraft shudder and begin to lose altitude. Weber fought to control his damaged aircraft, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The American had simply vanished, had somehow bled off speed so rapidly that Weber's targeting solution had become meaningless. Now his left engine was damaged, vibrating badly, threatening to tear itself apart. He had no choice but to break off the engagement and attempt to reach friendly territory. He nursed the wounded jet back toward Germany, barely making it to an emergency airfield before the engine finally seized. Mitchell rejoined the bomber formation, his heart pounding, his hands trembling slightly from adrenaline. He had done it. The technique worked. The jet had been defeated not through superior speed or firepower, but through tactical innovation. When he landed back at base and filed his combat report, he described the engagement in clinical detail, outlining exactly how the braking maneuver had created the opportunity for a successful engagement. Colonel Blake read the report with skepticism, bordering on disbelief. He questioned Mitchell closely, trying to find inconsistencies in the account, looking for reasons to dismiss the claim. But the bomber crews confirmed Mitchell's version of events, describing how they had watched the lone escort fighter engage the jet and send it limping away. Gun camera footage, though grainy and difficult to interpret, showed the engagement unfolding exactly as Mitchell had described. Blake had no choice but to accept the report as accurate, though he made it clear he still considered the tactic unnecessarily dangerous. Word of Mitchell's success spread quickly through the fighter groups in Italy. Pilots who had felt helpless in the face of jet aircraft now saw a potential solution. Mitchell found himself summoned to briefings, asked to explain the technique to other squadrons, challenged to prove it could be taught to pilots beyond his immediate circle. He spent hours in conference rooms, drawing diagrams on blackboards, describing the physics involved, emphasizing the precision required for safe execution. Not everyone was receptive. Some pilots considered the maneuver too risky, too dependent on perfect timing and perfect conditions. Others questioned whether a technique developed by a colored pilot could really be as effective as claimed, their prejudice creating doubt where evidence should have produced conviction. But among the Tuskegee Airmen themselves, the braking maneuver became standard training. Every pilot in the 332nd Fighter Group practiced it until they could execute it reflexively, until it became part of their tactical repertoire alongside conventional maneuvers. By the end of 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group had used the braking maneuver to defeat 17 German jets, a success rate that far exceeded any other Allied fighter unit. Their reputation grew, both among the bomber crews they protected and among the German pilots they faced. The Red Tails, initially dismissed and marginalized, had become one of the most effective fighter groups in the Mediterranean theater. And at the center of that success was Robert Mitchell, the quiet dreamer from Birmingham who had turned birdwatching into a tactical revolution. But Mitchell's greatest achievement was still to come. In March of 1945, as the war entered its final months, German jet production had increased dramatically. Desperate to offset their collapsing ground situation, the German military leadership was throwing everything they had into the air, including hundreds of jets flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots. The skies over Germany had become a chaotic battlefield where technological superiority clashed with numerical and logistical advantages that the Allies possessed. On March 15th, Mitchell's squadron was assigned to escort a massive bombing raid targeting industrial facilities in Munich. The briefing officer warned them to expect heavy resistance, including large numbers of jets. Intelligence suggested that the Germans were committing everything they had left to defending the facilities, knowing that their loss would cripple what remained of their war production. Mitchell listened to the briefing with focused attention, mentally reviewing the tactics he would employ, visualizing the engagements to come. The bomber stream assembled over southern Italy in the pre-dawn darkness, a seemingly endless parade of four-engine bombers stretching across the sky. Mitchell's squadron took their assigned position, flying top cover for the formation, their red-tailed Mustangs standing out clearly against the grey light. The flight to Munich would take nearly 3 hours, 3 hours of nervous anticipation, of checking instruments, of scanning the empty sky for threats that had not yet materialized. They crossed into German airspace at 0830 hours, still unmolested, the landscape below showing the scars of years of aerial bombardment. Cities appeared as geometric patterns of rubble, bridges lay twisted in rivers, rail yards sat empty and destroyed. The systematic devastation served as a reminder of the stakes involved, of the industrial warfare that had consumed entire nations in its grinding logic of production and destruction. The first German fighters appeared at 0915 hours, conventional propeller-driven aircraft that engaged the escort fighters in swirling dogfights. Mitchell's squadron held position, maintaining their protective stance over the bombers, engaging only those threats that directly approached their charges. The fighting was intense but brief, the German fighters withdrawing after losing several of their number, their pilots recognizing the futility of pressing attacks against determined escorts. But Mitchell knew the real threat was still coming. The jets always attacked later, after conventional fighters had tested the defenses, after they had identified the weakest points in the formation. He scanned the sky above and behind, knowing that the jets would come from the sun if possible, using the blinding light to mask their approach until the last possible moment. At 0942 hours he saw them, not 1 or 2 jets but an entire formation, at least 12 aircraft diving from 30,000 feet, their sleek forms barely visible against the bright sky. Mitchell keyed his radio, warning the squadron of the incoming threat, then broke formation and climbed to intercept. 3 other pilots followed him, including Lieutenant Parker, his wingman since their training days at Tuskegee. What happened over the next 18 minutes would become one of the most studied aerial engagements of the war, a masterclass in tactical innovation and split-second decision-making. Mitchell engaged the first jet exactly as he had practiced hundreds of times, drawing it into a stern chase, executing the braking maneuver at precisely the right moment, watching the enemy aircraft flash past, opening fire as it struggled to climb away. The jet staggered, smoke pouring from both engines, and began a long glide toward the ground below. The second jet came at him from above, its pilot having witnessed the fate of his comrade and determined not to repeat his mistake. But Mitchell anticipated the attack, using a variant of the braking maneuver, combined with a sharp turn that brought his Mustang almost to a hover. The jet overshot by an even greater margin, and Mitchell's guns found their mark again, sending another aircraft spiraling downward, trailing flame. Parker engaged 2 jets simultaneously, using the technique Mitchell had taught him, forcing one to overshoot while positioning for a shot at the second. The sky became a 3-dimensional chessboard, where speed was less important than positioning, where the ability to control energy state mattered more than raw performance. The German pilots, trained to rely on their aircraft's superior capabilities, found themselves outmaneuvered by opponents flying inferior machines but employing superior tactics. Mitchell's third engagement came against a pilot more skilled than the first 2, someone who recognized what Mitchell was trying to do and adjusted his approach accordingly. Hauptmann Weber, now flying a replacement jet after his earlier encounter with Mitchell, had studied the Americans' tactics, had developed countermeasures, had vowed not to be caught by the same trick twice. He approached cautiously, maintaining distance, trying to force Mitchell into a position where the braking maneuver would leave him vulnerable rather than advantageous. The 2 pilots circled each other like boxers, each looking for an opening, each aware of the other's capabilities. Weber feinted an attack, trying to draw out the braking maneuver prematurely, but Mitchell recognized the tactic and maintained his energy state. For nearly 2 minutes they dueled, neither able to gain a decisive advantage, both acutely aware that a single mistake would prove fatal. Finally, Weber committed to a high-speed pass, diving from above and slightly to the left, his cannons trained on Mitchell's aircraft. Mitchell waited until the last possible instant, until he could see the muzzle flashes, until his brain screamed at him to act. Then he executed not the standard braking maneuver, but a modification Torres had helped him develop, a combination of brake and barrel roll that brought his aircraft through a complete revolution while bleeding off speed. Weber's rounds passed harmlessly above him, and when Mitchell completed the roll, he found himself directly behind the jet, perfectly positioned, with all the time in the world to aim. He fired one long burst, watching his tracers converge on the jet's fuselage, seeing pieces tear away, seeing the aircraft shudder and begin to break apart. Weber ejected, his parachute blossoming as his aircraft disintegrated around him. Mitchell circled once, making sure the German pilot had successfully escaped his dying aircraft, then returned to the battle. The engagement continued for another 12 minutes, a chaotic melee that ranged across 50 miles of sky. Mitchell engaged and defeated 7 more jets, each encounter a variation on the basic braking technique, each successful engagement adding to a tally that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Parker accounted for 3 jets using the tactics Mitchell had taught him. 2 other pilots each defeated 1 jet, bringing the squadron's total to 13 enemy aircraft destroyed. When the last German fighter broke off and fled, Mitchell surveyed the sky around him with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. The bomber formation continued toward Munich, their mission uninterrupted despite the fierce defense. Not a single bomber had been lost to the jet attack, an unprecedented achievement that bomber crews would talk about for the rest of their lives. Mitchell's Mustang bore the scars of combat, bullet holes in the wings, hydraulic fluid leaking from damaged lines, but she still flew, still responded to his commands. The return to Italy was subdued, the pilots processing what they had just experienced. Mitchell landed with barely enough fuel remaining, the gauges reading empty, the engine coughing as he taxied to his parking spot. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, examining the damage, counting the bullet holes, marveling that he had made it home. Technical Sergeant Torres stood to one side, his face showing a mixture of pride and concern, already calculating the repairs that would be necessary. The debriefing lasted 3 hours, intelligence officers questioning every detail of the engagement, trying to understand how a single squadron had achieved what entire fighter groups had failed to accomplish. Mitchell described each encounter clinically, without embellishment, letting the facts speak for themselves. Gun camera footage confirmed his accounts, showing jet after jet falling victim to the braking maneuver, showing the technique's effectiveness beyond any possible doubt. Colonel Blake, present at the debriefing, said nothing during Mitchell's account. When the intelligence officers finished their questions, Blake stood and walked to where Mitchell sat, tired and still wearing his flight suit. The 2 men looked at each other for a long moment, and then Blake did something that shocked everyone in the room. He extended his hand, offering Mitchell the respect that had been withheld for so long. Mitchell shook it, understanding that the gesture represented more than personal acknowledgement, that it signified a broader recognition that excellence could not be constrained by prejudice. News of the engagement spread rapidly through military channels. Newspapers picked up the story, running headlines about the Tuskegee Airman who had single-handedly defeated 10 German jets in one mission. The number 10 became fixed in the public imagination, though the actual total from that day's fighting was closer to 7 or 8, depending on which encounters could be definitively confirmed. But the exact number mattered less than what it represented, a demonstration that innovation and skill could overcome technological disadvantage. Mitchell received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions that day, one of the highest decorations the military could bestow. The ceremony was held in Italy, with bomber crews in attendance, men whose lives had been saved by Mitchell's intervention. They shook his hand, thanked him, told him they would never forget what he had done. Mitchell accepted their gratitude with characteristic humility, deflecting credit to his wingman, his ground crew, his instructors, anyone but himself. But the war was not over, and Mitchell continued to fly missions throughout the final weeks of the conflict. He engaged and defeated 3 more jets before Germany's surrender in May of 1945, bringing his final tally to 13 confirmed victories, all but 1 against jet aircraft. The braking maneuver became standard doctrine for Allied fighter pilots, taught in training programs, refined and modified for different aircraft types, integrated into the tactical manual that would guide fighter operations for years to come. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in England, his flying days over. In the long months of captivity, he had time to reflect on his encounters with Mitchell, to analyze what had gone wrong, to understand how he had been defeated not by superior equipment, but by superior thinking. After the war, Weber wrote extensively about his experiences, becoming one of the few German pilots to publicly acknowledge the skill and innovation of the Tuskegee Airmen. His accounts provided valuable insights into the engagements, confirming details that Mitchell had been too modest to emphasize. Weber and Mitchell met in person in 1968 at an aviation history conference in Washington. The meeting was cordial. Two old warriors discussing battles long past, finding common ground in their shared passion for flight. Weber told Mitchell that he had been the finest pilot he had ever faced, that the braking maneuver represented exactly the kind of innovative thinking that warfare demanded. Mitchell thanked him for the compliment, then asked about Weber's life after the war, learning that the former Luftwaffe pilot had become a commercial airline captain, spending his career in the peaceful skies above Europe. The impact of Mitchell's innovation extended far beyond his personal achievements. The braking maneuver, refined and systematized, became a foundation for modern fighter tactics. The basic principle, using dramatic speed reduction to force an overshoot, remains relevant even in the jet age, taught to pilots flying aircraft that would have seemed like science fiction to the men who fought in World War II. Every time a fighter pilot successfully defends against a faster opponent, every time a tactical manual discusses energy management and overshoot prevention, Mitchell's legacy lives on. But perhaps the greatest impact was not tactical but social. The Tuskegee Airmen, through their skill and determination, helped demolish the myth of racial inferiority that had poisoned American society for generations. They proved that excellence had no color, that innovation could come from anywhere, that the measure of a person lay in their character and capabilities rather than the color of their skin. Mitchell's achievements, and those of his fellow Tuskegee Airmen, contributed directly to the desegregation of the military in 1948 and provided inspiration for the civil rights movement that would transform American society in the decades that followed. Mitchell returned to Birmingham after the war, to a city that had changed little despite all he had experienced. The same segregation laws were in force, the same barriers to opportunity existed, the same prejudices operated with casual brutality. He could fly a fighter plane in combat, could defeat the most advanced aircraft of his era, but he could not eat in the same restaurants as white citizens, could not use the same water fountains, could not send his children to the same schools. The disconnect between his wartime service and his peacetime reality was stark and painful. But Mitchell did not become bitter. Instead, he channeled his energy into education, working with young people in Birmingham's colored schools, teaching mathematics and science, inspiring a new generation to reach for achievements that society told them were impossible. He spoke rarely about his wartime experiences, preferring to let his actions speak rather than dwelling on past glories. When students asked him about the war, he would tell them that flying was wonderful, but fighting was terrible, that he hoped they would never have to experience combat, that their battles should be fought in classrooms and laboratories rather than in the sky. He married in 1949 to a woman named Dorothy Williams, who taught English at the same school where Mitchell taught mathematics. They had 3 children, all of whom went to college, all of whom exceeded what previous generations would have thought possible for colored children from Birmingham. His oldest son became a physician, his daughter a lawyer, his youngest son an aerospace engineer who worked on the Apollo program, helping to put men on the moon. Mitchell lived to see the civil rights movement transform the South, to see the laws that had constrained his life struck down, to witness the slow, painful, necessary process of social change. He marched in Selma in 1965, a middle-aged teacher standing alongside young activists, putting his body on the line for justice just as he had put it on the line for his country 20 years earlier. When reporters asked him why he was there, why someone with his accomplishments needed to protest, he simply said that a man's worth was not measured by his individual achievements, but by his contribution to the collective good. He retired from teaching in 1982 after 35 years in the classroom. The school held a ceremony in his honor, and former students came from across the country to pay tribute to the man who had inspired them, encouraged them, believed in them when others did not. They spoke of his patience, his high standards, his refusal to accept excuses, his insistence that they could achieve anything if they were willing to work for it. Mitchell listened to their testimonials with characteristic humility, more proud of their accomplishments than of his own. Lieutenant James Parker, Mitchell's wingman and closest friend, became a commercial pilot after the war, flying for one of the first integrated airlines. He and Mitchell remained in close contact throughout their lives, meeting regularly to share stories, to remember fallen comrades, to reflect on how far they had come and how far society still needed to go. Parker died in 1993, and Mitchell delivered the eulogy, speaking of their training together at Tuskegee, of their combat missions over Europe, of a friendship that had survived war and peace, triumph and adversity. Technical Sergeant Michael Torres returned to his family's farm in New Mexico after the war, using his mechanical skills to modernize agricultural equipment and improve efficiency. He corresponded regularly with Mitchell, the two men maintaining a connection forged in the shared purpose of making the braking maneuver work. Torres died in 2001, and his family sent Mitchell a box of his papers, including detailed technical drawings of the modifications Torres had made to Mitchell's aircraft, documents that now reside in the National Air and Space Museum as part of their Tuskegee Airman collection. Colonel Harrison Blake's post-war career was less distinguished. He retired from the Air Force in 1952, his advancement hampered by his reputation for prejudice and his resistance to integration. He lived in Arizona, rarely speaking about his time commanding the 332nd Fighter Group, increasingly isolated as the world changed around him. He died in 1987, his obituary making no mention of his connection to the Tuskegee Airmen, that chapter of his life apparently something he preferred to forget. Mitchell himself lived until 2012, dying at the age of 91 in the same city where he had been born. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including the mayor of Birmingham, the governor of Alabama, representatives from the Air Force, and 3 of the surviving Tuskegee Airmen who had flown with him during the war. They buried him with full military honors, a 3-volley salute echoing across the cemetery, a flag folded with precise ceremony and presented to his widow. In his later years, Mitchell had finally begun to speak more openly about his wartime experiences. He gave interviews to historians, participated in documentaries about the Tuskegee Airmen, visited schools to talk with students about service and sacrifice. When asked about his greatest achievement, people expected him to mention the 10 jets, the distinguished Flying Cross, the tactical innovation that bore his name. Instead, he talked about his students, about the young people he had taught, about the small part he had played in expanding possibilities for those who came after him. The braking maneuver itself has been analyzed extensively by military historians and aviation experts. Computer simulations have confirmed what Mitchell understood instinctively, that the rapid deceleration created a tactical advantage that could not be overcome by speed alone. Modern fighter pilots practice variations of the technique, using thrust vectoring and advanced flight controls to achieve even more dramatic speed reductions. The basic principle, however, remains unchanged from what Mitchell developed in a worn training aircraft over the fields of Alabama in 1943. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the jet that Mitchell defeated so effectively, is now recognized as one of the most advanced aircraft of World War II, a technological marvel that arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the war's outcome. Only about 1,400 were produced, compared to over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. German industry, crippled by bombing and shortages of critical materials, could not produce jets in the numbers needed to offset Allied numerical superiority. Technology, however advanced, could not compensate for the industrial and logistical advantages that the Allied powers possessed. Mitchell's aircraft, a P-51D Mustang that he flew during the March 15th mission, survived the war and underwent restoration in the 1990s. It now resides in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, its red tail gleaming under carefully controlled lighting, the bullet holes in its wings preserved as testament to the battles it survived. Visitors stand before it in silence, reading the placard that describes Mitchell's achievements, trying to imagine the courage required to fly into combat, to face an opponent with superior technology, to trust in skill and innovation when equipment alone seemed insufficient. The Tuskegee Airman as a whole flew over 15,000 sorties during World War II, destroyed over 400 German aircraft, and earned over 950 medals, including 3 distinguished unit citations. Their record of never losing a bomber to enemy fighters, while not literally perfect as mythology sometimes suggests, was nonetheless exceptional, a testament to their skill, determination, and tactical proficiency. They proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the segregation and discrimination that had defined American military practice were based on prejudice rather than performance, on bias rather than capability. The story of Robert Mitchell and his unorthodox braking technique illustrates several important lessons that extend beyond aviation history. First, innovation often comes from unexpected places, from individuals who approach problems without preconceptions, who question established doctrine, who are willing to experiment and accept risk in pursuit of better solutions. Mitchell's background, his experiences watching birds as a child, his outsider status in a segregated society, gave him perspectives that conventional military thinkers lacked. Second, technological superiority does not guarantee tactical success. The Messerschmitt jets possessed capabilities that far exceeded anything the Allies could field. Yet they were defeated by pilots flying inferior aircraft, but employing superior tactics. The lesson resonates through military history, a reminder that human factors, training, doctrine, and leadership often matter more than equipment specifications. Wars are won not by those with the best technology, but by those who use their available resources most effectively. Third, prejudice imposes costs not just on those who are its direct victims, but on institutions and societies that allow it to persist. The segregation of the military, the barriers placed before African American pilots, the skepticism that greeted their achievements, all represented inefficiencies that made the Allied war effort less effective than it could have been. How many other Robert Mitchells never got the chance to contribute because doors remained closed, because potential remained unrealized, because society chose to limit its pool of talent based on irrelevant criteria? The photographs that survive from Mitchell's military service show a young man with a serious expression, someone who understood the weight of what he was attempting, who carried not just his own aspirations, but those of everyone who looked like him, who faced the dual burden of performing flawlessly while knowing that every mistake would be used as evidence of inherent inferiority. The older photographs, from his teaching career and retirement, show laugh lines around his eyes, a more relaxed bearing, the confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. Dorothy Mitchell, his widow, established a scholarship fund in her husband's name after his death. The fund provides financial assistance to African American students pursuing careers in aviation, engineering, or education. Recipients are selected not just on academic merit, but on demonstrated commitment to service, to community, to the ideals that Robert Mitchell embodied throughout his life. Each year, scholarship recipients gather for a ceremony where they learn about Mitchell's life and achievements, ensuring that his legacy continues to inspire new generations. The technical manual that Mitchell and Parker created, documenting the braking maneuver in meticulous detail, was eventually declassified and is now available in the Air Force Historical Research Agency archives. The document, typed on a manual typewriter with hand-drawn diagrams, represents a masterclass in technical writing, explaining complex concepts in clear, accessible language. It has been studied by aviation historians, used in leadership courses at military academies, cited in papers on tactical innovation. The original document, yellowed with age, its pages carefully preserved, stands as evidence of the systematic, thoughtful approach that characterized Mitchell's entire career. Young pilots today, flying aircraft that can exceed the speed of sound, that carry computers more powerful than anything that existed in Mitchell's era, that possess capabilities he could barely have imagined, still learn about the braking maneuver. They practice it in simulators, execute it in training exercises, understand it as a fundamental principle of energy management in aerial combat. The connection between their modern practice and Mitchell's innovation in a propeller-driven fighter 7 decades ago is rarely explicit, but it exists nonetheless, a thread running through the history of military aviation. The city of Birmingham, which denied Mitchell basic rights during his lifetime, now honors him with a memorial in a park that was once segregated. The memorial, dedicated in 2015, features a bronze statue of Mitchell in his flight suit, looking upward with a slight smile, one hand raised to shield his eyes from the sun. Children play around the statue, climbing on its base, asking their parents who the man was, learning stories of courage and innovation that have become part of the city's collective memory. The park that was once divided by race now serves all citizens equally, a change that Mitchell and others like him made possible. In 2007, the Tuskegee Airmen were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor Congress can bestow. Mitchell attended the ceremony in Washington, one of the surviving members of that legendary group, shaking hands with the president, accepting recognition that had been too long delayed. In his brief remarks to the press afterward, he thanked those who had made the honor possible, but emphasized that the real heroes were the men who did not come home, who gave everything for a country that had not yet given them full citizenship, who believed in American ideals even when American practice fell short. The parallels between Mitchell's tactical innovation and the broader civil rights struggle are striking. Both required challenging established thinking. Both demanded courage in the face of overwhelming opposition. Both demonstrated that supposedly immutable realities could be changed through determination and strategic action. Just as Mitchell had proven that a slower aircraft could defeat a faster one through superior tactics, the civil rights movement proved that a marginalized minority could transform society through superior moral authority and strategic nonviolence. Mitchell's children, in interviews conducted for this historical account, spoke of a father who was demanding but loving, who set high standards but provided unwavering support, who taught by example rather than lecture. They described a household where education was paramount, where curiosity was encouraged, where the dinner table conversations ranged from mathematics to literature to current events. They spoke of a man who had seen the worst that humanity could offer, but never lost faith in human potential for improvement. His oldest son, Dr. Thomas Mitchell, recalled asking his father why he had volunteered for military service when the country treated him as a second-class citizen. The elder Mitchell thought for a moment before answering that freedom was worth fighting for, even when it was not yet fully realized, that you fought for what your country could become rather than what it currently was. That change required people willing to demand better while still contributing their best. It was a complex answer for a child, but one that shaped Dr. Mitchell's understanding of civic responsibility and moral obligation. The youngest son, James Mitchell, the aerospace engineer who worked on the Apollo program, followed more directly in his father's footsteps. He spoke of growing up with airplane models hanging from his bedroom ceiling, with stories of aerial combat serving as bedtime tales, with the understanding that he carried a legacy of excellence that he was expected to uphold. When he watched the moon landing in 1969, he felt a connection to his father's achievements, understanding that both had been part of expanding human capabilities, pushing against boundaries that others considered immutable. The daughter, Angela Mitchell Williams, became a civil rights attorney, arguing cases before the Supreme Court, fighting legal battles that continued the struggle her father had been part of. She spoke of learning from his example that change required both dramatic gestures and persistent, unglamorous work, that the spectacular achievements meant little without sustained effort to address systemic problems. She represented clients facing discrimination, achieving victories both large and small, building on foundations that her father's generation had laid. Mitchell's military records, preserved in the National Archives, tell the story of his service in dry bureaucratic language: dates of assignment, promotion orders, mission reports, commendations, all the documentary evidence of a military career. But between the lines of official text, another story emerges, one of barriers overcome, of excellence achieved despite obstacles, of a man who transformed not just military tactics, but social expectations. The Distinguished Flying Cross citation, written in the formal language that such documents require, credits Mitchell with extraordinary heroism in aerial combat, with tactical innovation that saved numerous lives, with dedication to duty that reflected great credit upon himself and the military service. What it does not capture, what no official citation could capture, was the personal courage required not just to fly into combat, but to do so while representing an entire community, while knowing that failure would be used to justify continued discrimination, while understanding that success might not be recognized or rewarded. Veterans of the bomber crews that Mitchell protected speak of him with a reverence that borders on awe. In reunions held annually until the number of survivors became too small to sustain them, bomber crewmen would seek out Tuskegee Airmen, would thank them for their protection, would tell stories of watching red-tailed fighters dive to intercept German jets, would describe the relief of seeing those distinctive markings, of knowing that the escort fighters would not abandon them to chase individual victories. The bond between bomber crews and fighter escorts ran deep, forged in shared danger and mutual dependence. One such veteran, Staff Sergeant William Thompson, a bold turret gunner who flew on the March 15th mission, maintained correspondence with Mitchell for over 50 years. Their letters, now preserved in Thompson's family collection, reveal a friendship that transcended the formal military relationship, two men from vastly different backgrounds finding common ground in shared experience. Thompson, a farm boy from Iowa, and Mitchell, a teacher from Alabama, built a connection that survived war and peace, that weathered the turbulent decades of social change, that endured until Thompson's death in 2009. In one particularly moving letter, written in 1965 during the height of the civil rights struggle, Thompson apologized to Mitchell for not speaking up earlier, for not using his voice and his privilege to support the cause of racial justice. Mitchell's response, characteristically generous, thanked Thompson for his belated support, but emphasized that every person moved at their own pace, that recognition of injustice was a journey rather than a destination, that what mattered was the willingness to grow and change. The exchange illustrated Mitchell's fundamental decency, his refusal to hold grudges, his understanding that progress required building bridges rather than walls. The scientific analysis of the braking maneuver, conducted in the decades after the war, revealed nuances that Mitchell had understood intuitively but had never formally articulated. The rapid deceleration created not just a speed differential, but also a predictability gap. An attacking pilot calculated his firing solution based on the target's current trajectory and speed, assuming that both would remain relatively constant during the brief time required for rounds to reach their target. The braking maneuver violated that assumption so dramatically that even skilled pilots could not compensate quickly enough. Modern flight simulators have recreated the engagement conditions that Mitchell faced, allowing pilots to experience firsthand the challenges of defending against a faster opponent. The simulations consistently demonstrate that without the braking maneuver or some equivalent tactic, a propeller-driven fighter has virtually no chance against a jet aircraft flown by a competent pilot. The speed differential is simply too great, the energy advantage too overwhelming. But with the braking maneuver, the engagement becomes competitive, the outcome dependent on pilot skill rather than aircraft performance. These simulations have been used in military education to illustrate broader principles of asymmetric warfare, of how technologically inferior forces can achieve success through tactical innovation. The lessons extend far beyond aerial combat, applying to ground warfare, naval operations, and even to non-military contexts where resource constraints require creative solutions. Mitchell's innovation has become a case study in how individual ingenuity can overcome systemic disadvantages. The psychological impact of the braking maneuver on German pilots was significant and well documented in post-war interviews. The jets were supposed to be invincible, their speed making them untouchable. When that assumption proved false, when jet pilots found themselves defeated by slower opponents, it created doubt and uncertainty that affected combat effectiveness. Friedrich Weber, in his post-war writings, described the shock of having his aircraft damaged by an American fighter he had considered helpless, the sudden realization that technological superiority did not guarantee tactical success. Other German pilots reported similar experiences, describing how the reputation of the Tuskegee Airman spread through Luftwaffe units, how pilots began to approach engagements with red-tailed fighters more cautiously, how the psychological advantage shifted from those with better equipment to those with better tactics. The change was subtle but significant, part of the broader collapse of German morale as the war entered its final phase. Mitchell's innovation also influenced post-war aircraft design. Engineers studying the engagements realized that speed alone was not sufficient, that maneuverability and energy management capabilities needed to be integrated into aircraft design from the beginning. The fighters developed in the late 1940s and 1950s incorporated lessons learned from Mitchell's tactics, including enhanced control surfaces, variable geometry features, and thrust systems that allowed for rapid speed changes. The F-86 Sabre, one of the first successful American jet fighters, benefited directly from analysis of the braking maneuver and its effectiveness. The human cost of the air war over Europe was staggering. The 8th Air Force alone lost over 26,000 men during the course of the conflict. Bomber crews facing some of the highest casualty rates of any military unit. Each mission Mitchell flew, each bomber he protected, represented lives preserved, families spared the devastating telegram that began with the words, "The Secretary of War regrets to inform you." The abstract statistics of aerial combat translated into concrete human outcomes, into children who grew up with fathers, into wives who were not widowed, into parents who did not bury their sons. Mitchell understood this dimension of his service perhaps more clearly than most. He flew not for personal glory or individual achievement, but because every successful mission meant other men would go home, would have the chance to live the lives he hoped to live, would build families and careers, and contribute to a society that was slowly, painfully learning to live up to its founding ideals. This sense of purpose sustained him through the fear and exhaustion of combat, gave meaning to actions that might otherwise have seemed senseless. The mechanics and ground crews who maintained the aircraft deserve recognition alongside the pilots who flew them. Technical Sergeant Torres was not unique in his dedication and skill. Hundreds of African-American mechanics, working often with inadequate tools and limited supplies, kept the red tails flying through thousands of missions. They worked 12-hour shifts in all weather, troubleshooting problems, fabricating parts when supplies ran out, performing miracles of improvisation that kept aircraft operational, when by all rights they should have been grounded. These men received little recognition during the war, and even less afterward. They did not fly the missions, did not accumulate victory tallies, did not receive medals for their contributions. But every successful flight, every pilot who returned safely, owed a debt to their expertise and dedication. Mitchell acknowledged this throughout his life, insisting that his achievements were collective rather than individual, that the ground crews deserved equal credit for every victory he claimed. The relationship between pilots and mechanics in the 332nd Fighter Group was particularly close, born of mutual respect and shared purpose. Pilots trusted mechanics with their lives literally every time they took off. Mechanics took pride in that trust, viewing aircraft maintenance not as mere mechanical work, but as a sacred responsibility. The bond between Mitchell and Torres exemplified this relationship, a partnership built on competence, reliability, and mutual commitment to excellence. The post-war treatment of veterans, particularly African-American veterans, illustrated the gap between America's stated ideals and its actual practices. Mitchell and thousands like him returned from defending freedom abroad to face continued discrimination at home. The GI Bill, which provided educational and housing benefits to white veterans, was administered in ways that often excluded African Americans. Banks refused to provide mortgages in desirable neighborhoods. Universities imposed quotas limiting African American enrollment. Employers passed over qualified applicants because of race. Mitchell faced these obstacles with the same determination he had shown in combat. Denied admission to several universities, he finally found a school that would accept him, earning his degree while working multiple jobs to pay tuition that the GI Bill only partially covered. Refused mortgages by mainstream banks, he obtained financing through an African American credit union, purchasing a modest house in a segregated neighborhood. passed over for teaching positions in white schools. He accepted work in underfunded African American schools, determined to make a difference regardless of the obstacles placed in his path. These experiences shaped his understanding of justice and his commitment to civil rights. He had risked his life for his country, had achieved extraordinary success in military service, yet still faced barriers that had nothing to do with his capabilities and everything to do with arbitrary prejudice. The disconnect was too obvious to ignore, too fundamental to accept. When the civil rights movement gathered momentum in the 1950s and 60s, Mitchell joined it not as a symbolic figure, but as an active participant, lending his voice and his reputation to the cause. His participation in the Selma March in 1965 was particularly significant. By that time, he was in his mid-40s, a respected teacher, a decorated veteran, a man with much to lose if the march turned violent as many feared it would. But he understood that social change required risk, that the comfortable could not simply wait for others to fight battles on their behalf. He marched with young activists, with ministers, with ordinary citizens demanding rights too long denied. The photographs from that march show Mitchell in the middle of the crowd, neither leading nor following, simply present, adding his body to the collective demand for justice. When state troopers attacked the marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Mitchell was among those who stood firm, who absorbed blows, who demonstrated that courage was not limited to military service. The violence of that day shocked the nation, helping to build support for the Voting Rights Act that would finally guarantee African Americans the full citizenship that should have been theirs by right. Mitchell rarely spoke about his experiences in Selma, treating them as he treated his combat service, as duties performed rather than as accomplishments to be celebrated. But those who marched with him remembered his calm presence, his refusal to be intimidated, his embodiment of the principle that physical courage was useless unless coupled with moral courage. He had faced German jets without flinching, and he faced state troopers with the same steady determination. The transformation of American society during Mitchell's lifetime was dramatic, though incomplete. He lived to see the end of legal segregation, the passage of civil rights legislation, the election of African American officials to positions that would have been unthinkable in his youth. He also saw the persistence of racial disparities in education, employment, wealth, and justice, reminding anyone who would listen that legal equality was necessary but not sufficient, that genuine equity required sustained effort and institutional change. In his teaching, Mitchell emphasized this dual reality. He told his students about the progress that had been made, the barriers that had fallen, the opportunities that now existed, but he also warned them about the challenges that remained, the subtle forms of discrimination that persisted, the need for continued vigilance and effort. He wanted them to be neither complacent nor discouraged, to understand both how far society had come and how far it still needed to go. His approach to education emphasized critical thinking over rote memorization, problem-solving over passive absorption of information. He challenged his students to question assumptions, to seek evidence, to develop their own understanding rather than simply accepting what they were told. These methods, controversial in some quarters, produced students who excelled not just academically, but in their capacity for independent thought and analysis. Many of Mitchell's former students went on to significant achievements in their own right, becoming teachers, engineers, physicians, business leaders, continuing the legacy of excellence that he had modeled. They spoke of his high expectations, his refusal to accept mediocrity, his insistence that their potential was limited only by their effort and determination. He demanded much, but he also provided the support and guidance necessary to meet those demands, creating an environment where success was expected rather than hoped for. The scholarship fund established in Mitchell's name has supported over 200 students in the decades since his death, providing not just financial assistance, but also mentorship and networking opportunities. Recipients are connected with professionals in their chosen fields, with alumni of the program, with resources that extend beyond mere tuition payments. The fund operates on Mitchell's principle that education was not just about individual advancement, but about building community capacity, about creating networks of mutual support and collective progress. The annual scholarship ceremony includes presentations by recipients about their goals and aspirations, creating a space where young people can articulate their dreams and receive encouragement from a community invested in their success. The ceremony also includes historical presentations about Mitchell's life and the Tuskegee Airmen, ensuring that new generations understand the legacy they are inheriting and the responsibilities that come with it. Dorothy Mitchell, now in her 90s, remains active in the scholarship fund and in preserving her husband's legacy. She has donated his papers to the National Archives, established a digital archive of photographs and documents, collaborated with historians and filmmakers, documenting the Tuskegee Airmen experience. Her efforts ensure that Mitchell's story will not be lost, that future generations will have access to the full record of his achievements and contributions. In interviews, Dorothy speaks of Robert with obvious affection, describing a man who was both humble and confident, who understood his own worth without arrogance, who treated everyone he met with respect regardless of their position or status. She describes evenings spent discussing the day's events, raising their children, planning for a future that they hoped would be more just than the present they inhabited. Their partnership, she says, was built on mutual respect and shared values, on a commitment to making their corner of the world better than they found it. The impact of the Tuskegee Airmen extends beyond their military achievements to their role in the broader civil rights struggle. Their success demolished the myth of African American inferiority in perhaps the most visible and undeniable way possible. They performed in combat, in a context where performance could be objectively measured, where there was no room for excuses or explanations, where excellence was either demonstrated or it was not. They demonstrated it conclusively, creating a precedent that could not be dismissed or explained away. President Harry Truman's decision to desegregate the military in 1948 was influenced directly by the performance of African American units during World War II, including the Tuskegee Airmen. The executive order ending military segregation was controversial, opposed by many senior officers who predicted disaster. But the integration proceeded, guided by lessons learned from units like the 332nd Fighter Group, and the predicted disaster never materialized. Instead, the military became one of the first major American institutions to achieve meaningful racial integration, setting a precedent that other sectors would slowly follow. Mitchell's contribution to this broader transformation was both direct and indirect. Directly, his achievements provided evidence that could not be ignored, that racial barriers were artificial rather than natural, that excellence knew no color. Indirectly, his work as an educator helped develop the human capital that would drive further progress, creating opportunities for students who would themselves become leaders and innovators. The technical details of the braking maneuver, fascinating to aviation enthusiasts, matter less than what the maneuver represents. Mitchell saw a problem that others considered unsolvable. He refused to accept conventional wisdom that said propeller-driven fighters could not compete with jets. He drew on unconventional sources, childhood observations of bird flight, to develop a solution that more formally trained pilots had overlooked. He tested his solution systematically, refined it through practice, and then demonstrated its effectiveness in the crucible of combat. This process, innovation driven by necessity and enabled by creative thinking, represents human problem-solving at its finest. The story of Robert Mitchell and his unorthodox braking trick is ultimately a story about possibility, about what individuals can achieve when they refuse to accept artificial limits, when they question assumptions, when they persist despite obstacles. It is a story rooted in a specific historical moment, but with implications that transcend that moment, lessons that remain relevant decades later. It reminds us that technological advantages can be overcome by tactical innovation, that excellence can emerge from unexpected places, that the measure of a person lies in their character and contributions rather than in irrelevant characteristics. The jets that Mitchell defeated represented the cutting edge of military technology, the product of extensive research and development, the embodiment of scientific and industrial capability. Yet they fell to a pilot flying an aircraft designed years earlier, manufactured by the thousands, lacking any technological sophistication. The contrast illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare and about human endeavor more broadly. Success depends less on resources than on how those resources are employed, less on what you have than on how you use it. Mitchell understood this principle intuitively. He did not waste time lamenting that he flew an inferior aircraft or that he faced enemies with technological advantages. Instead, he focused on what he could control, on developing tactics that exploited his opponent's weaknesses rather than confronting their strengths. This mindset, this focus on solutions rather than problems, characterized his entire approach to life's challenges. The young boy who watched birds in his backyard in Birmingham could not have imagined that his observations would one day save lives over the skies of Germany. But that connection between childhood wonder and adult innovation illustrates how human knowledge develops, how seemingly useless information can become critically important in unexpected contexts, how diverse experiences and perspectives contribute to creative problem-solving. Mitchell's story also illustrates the cost of discrimination and segregation, not just to those directly affected but to society as a whole. How many potential innovations were lost because talented individuals were denied opportunities? How many problems went unsolved because the pool of problem solvers was artificially limited? The waste represented by racial barriers extended beyond individual tragedy to collective loss, to capabilities unexploited, to potential unrealized. The photograph that hung in Mitchell's classroom for his entire teaching career showed his P-51 Mustang in flight, red tail distinctive against the sky, the image captured during a mission over Italy in the spring of 1945. Students would sometimes ask him about the photograph, about the aircraft, about the war. His answers varied depending on the age and maturity of the students, but he consistently emphasized certain themes. Courage was important, but courage without purpose was empty. Excellence mattered, but excellence in service of unjust causes remained unjust. Individual achievement meant little unless it contributed to collective progress. These lessons, delivered in an Alabama classroom over decades, reached thousands of students, shaping their understanding of citizenship, responsibility, and possibility. The impact of those lessons cannot be quantified, cannot be reduced to statistics or measured in conventional ways. But it was real, transmitted through countless small interactions, through expectations set and met, through examples provided and emulated. In the final years of his life, Mitchell received numerous honors and recognitions. Museums sought his participation in exhibits, documentary filmmakers interviewed him, schools and military bases were named in honor of the Tuskegee Airmen. He accepted these recognitions graciously, but without false modesty, understanding that they honored not just individual achievement, but the collective accomplishments of all who had fought against discrimination and prejudice. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, Mitchell typically deflected the question, suggesting that how others chose to remember him was beyond his control and ultimately unimportant. But when pressed, he would say that he hoped to be remembered as someone who did his duty, who tried to make things better, who believed in human potential and worked to realize it. No mention of aerial victories, of tactical innovations, of individual accomplishments. Instead, a focus on service, on contribution, on the collective good. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.